Good afternoon, everyone. You know, it's amazing how every year we do this series, and it just it goes by, as they say in German, in ein Augenblick. It is the blink of an eye, but that's what happens in this fast-moving, 24/7 news cycle world that we occupy. I'd like to, as we're coming to a close, I would love to give a huge hand. You probably don't even think about it, but PSU's Campus AV are heroes. They make this happen every week. That's how you can hear what we're saying. That's how you can see the stream that is up and out there in the world. So let's give the AV folks a big hand. And I would like to thank them for playing the wonderful sounds of Thelonious Monk as we came into here. It's Great Decisions Radio. So we kicked off our speaker series this last Sunday. How many of you were there? Well, I think you count, but yes. We were really excited. We were very excited to move into a new space. We are working some kinks out, and I loved getting the feedback that, can you just move the lectern a little bit more to center stage so I can see it? And I said yes, because we realized after the fact that it was a little over here, and it kind of makes the stage do that. So we're working that out. We're excited for the next one. We've got a little bit of time between now and then. We've got some great things coming up. We have a youth forum happening on the 15th. It's going to be at Concordia College, or Concordia University, who is one of our wonderful sponsors. That is a week from today, and it has been entirely generated by the youth that we work with. Instead of us going, oh, here are the 5 ideas we think are going to change your lives, we asked them, what is defining the next generation for you and your peers? How do you want to go about it? We can learn a lot by asking questions in places that we don't even have, a clue of an answer in. So the child shall lead us. That's on our website, worldoregon.org. Very, very excited also that on the 21st, we have Ambassador Joseph Yun, who was on the ground in Hanoi at the summit that didn't summit. And he is going to talk about what just happened and where we are going. That's the 21st. It's in the evening, 7 p.m. in our offices. Love to see you all there. And then the following Monday, Ambassador Gordon Sondland will be here talking about transatlantic ties and our relationship with the EU. So we've got some tickets left for that. I've been instructed by our development director that WorldQuest is on the horizon. WorldQuest is May 10th. WorldQuest is the one fundraiser we do during the year that makes possible things like this, things like our youth programs, keeping the lights on, putting coffee in the kitchen, all those kinds of things that help us bring you programs for nearly 70 years. So May 10th, it's going to be at the Loft in Southeast Portland. If you've never been to WorldQuest, it is unlike any fundraiser you've been to in town. You know, all those boring fundraisers where they do an auction and you have like rubber chicken and everyone's eyes are just, sort of going off by 9 o'clock. At this one, you actually wear costumes, you do trivia, you have fun, you get some wine in there, you support a good cause, and you get to watch people kind of letting their guard down and remembering that we're all here on this world to not only have great decisions made, but have a little fun in the process. So May 10th, keep that on your schedules. Also, a big plea for all of you. We have a group of Pan-African youth coming to town in April. We've got kids they're 15 to 17-year-olds. They are from the Gambia, they're from Mozambique, Kenya, and Sudan. They're going to be here for 10 days, and we are really desperately, and I'm not using that word lightly, we are looking for homestays for them. These kids are incredible. We've been doing this for a number of years. We get Pan-African youth from French-speaking and English-speaking countries. Many of these countries are countries that are still navigating the aftershocks of colonialism. They're dealing with resource curse, conflict, all kinds of things. But you see these 15 to 17-year-olds who are so full of hope. We can all learn lessons from the energy that they are bringing into our community and the energy that they're taking back while they go and create action projects that will benefit their communities. So if you want a transformational experience, there is nothing like opening up your home for somebody from 8,000 miles away and learning a bit from each other. So again, worldoregon.org, you can find all that info. You can also just email Laura in our office, that's laura@worldoregon.org. And even just think about it, and if it's not you, if you know someone who might want to host a youth, if it's not in April, in July we've got youth from Iraq and we've got youth from Bolivia and Peru in October. More and more we are investing in this demographic because that's where the change starts. So anyway, this is our last Great Decisions. I joke every year, I always feel like Carol Burnett when we get to this point, and I say, I tug on my ear and I say, I'm so glad we've had this time together. Today's speaker is new to me, and I'm really excited to, not just have the same folks year in, year out. And what's really exciting is that Marilyn in our office said, "Oh my God, you have one of my professors as a speaker," and she was like so excited. And it's like, so you have like celebrity status already. Maureen Hickey. Maureen Hickey is a human geography with research specialties in international development, internal and international migration, and migration policy and advocacy. Her regional specialty is East and Southeast Asia. Before joining the Department of International and Global Studies here at PSU, she was a research fellow with the Migration Research Cluster at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore, where my uncle taught econ for 20 years. While she was there, she organized and led 4 international workshops in international migration theory and policy. She has co-edited special journal issues of Population, Space and Place, Geoform. I know you guys have these on your coffee tables at home, so you might want to go back and find your favorite issues. And the Singapore Journal of Tropical Geography. As a fellow, she also worked as a consultant for the Migrating Out of Poverty program on migration policy initiatives in Southeast Asia. Her most recent publication in Discourse, Studies in the Cultural Politics of Education, comes out of an ongoing project on highly skilled migrants from the Philippines and Anglo-Africa. See, we get back to English-speaking Africa again. She's a full-time lecturer at PSU where she teaches courses on international development, globalization, nationalism, transnationalism, migration, and Asian studies. Let's give Maureen a big hand.
Well, can everyone hear me okay? All right, between the mic, my script, because I have to have a script, otherwise I go off on wild tangents, as my students will tell you, and the clicker, I may be sort of over on this side a little bit more than I usually would. I'll try to walk around, but cut me some slack, because otherwise I'll be dropping things, and it won't be pretty. All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to talk with you today. I want to start with a statement that I hope that we can all agree on, and that is that migration, and particularly international migration, has become a flashpoint for political controversy and national debate around the world. Now, we're most familiar with this context here in the United States, but we can see that immigration has become a contentious issue in many countries in the world. On top of that, the issue of involuntary or forced migration or refugee migration has also become an urgent and politically polarizing topic around the world. Now, as any good migration scholar will point out, humans have always migrated, and yet we have to start off with a couple of quick facts or caveats. So first of all, the vast majority of humans, both in human history and today, have not and do not migrate. It turns out that human beings are very attached to place. I know this because I'm a geographer, so you can trust me. And it turns out it's one of our defining characteristics as a species. For those who do migrate, most don't go very far, usually less than 50 miles. Sometimes up to 150. In the contemporary era, most people who migrate within their own national borders. The other fact that we have to take in, however, although the overall percentage of international migration has not changed significantly, it's still around 3% of global population, since human population itself has increased exponentially over the past 150 years. This is still a lot of people. The second fact that we have to keep in mind is most migrants in the world today are not refugees. However, I will return to the question of how we categorize and sort of slot migrants into different statuses in a few minutes. Okay. However, that being said, it would be willful obtuseness to deny that migration is one of the most acrimonious topics of our time. In addition, it seems perverse to look into the face of human suffering and need in terms of the multiple humanitarian and refugee crises that we see unfolding in the world today and argue that, well, as a percentage, it's actually really low. That may be true, but it's kind of beside the point because we're still talking about tens of millions of people. And of course, if this wasn't one of the key issues or great decisions of our time, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. So what I want to talk today about is the big picture. How did we get here, broadly speaking? What's happening now? And how can we move forward to perhaps change and open up conversations about migration and immigration, both in our country and more broadly? I think that you'll probably leave here with more questions than answers, more than I can answer in the question period, but I hope you'll enjoy taking this journey with me. So let's start with some big picture context. So where are we and how did we get here? Well, there are two major trajectories that have come to shape our world today in the current era. And in some ways, these trends and trajectories seem like they contradict each other, but in fact, they're closely interconnected, and they often relate to one another in interesting ways. First of all, if we look at geopolitics, we live in a world of nation-states, separate sovereign countries, and no country in the world today has open borders. Historically speaking, this political system is very new in the organization of human society. However, it has a profound impact on both our quality of life and our sense of identity in every sense of the word. So the country that you're a citizen of, or that you're born in, or you become a citizen of, determines your rights, your responsibilities. It also shapes your identity. Second, we also live in an increasingly interconnected world. We usually talk about this in terms of economics, but in other ways as well. We have heightened or intensified movement and circulation of goods, capital, information, and yes, although it is to a much lesser extent, people. This is usually termed globalization or globalized capitalism. Sorry, I'm going to cut apart here. Both of these are uneven in that they create geographies of inequality, and both of these have led to increasing and shifting streams of international migration over the past 4 to 5 decades. So far, so good. But the next question we may ask is, who is migrating and where are they migrating from or to? To describe how flows of international migration work, scholars generally use two kinds of geographic distinctions. One is for the 30 to 35 odd highly developed or wealthy countries, which are called or termed the global north. The other is the approximately 170 other countries, which are considered to be developing, less wealthy, and they're termed the global south. So with that, we can look at our 4 different kinds of migration flows that we see in the world today. So approximately 35 to 36% of international migration stock in the world today is from developing countries to other developing countries, from the global south to other places in the global south. This is usually, but not always, what we term cross-border migration. In other words, you cross a border to a neighboring country. The same amount, approximately, around 35, 36%, are migrants that are moving from developing countries to wealthy countries, from the global south to the global north. This is the group that has been steadily increasing in overall percentages over the past 30 years. And this is the group that most people are talking about when they talk about debates over international migration in the world today. Around a quarter of international migrants come from wealthy countries and go to other wealthy countries. And about 6 to 10% come from the global north and go to developing countries. So that's the big picture. But in a way, excuse me, I have to take a drink. That puts the horse before the cart, which is a very old saying, but I don't have a better one at the moment. We may ask, faced with these numbers, a more simple question. And that is, what is migration and who is a migrant? Now, like all good, simple questions, it seems like the answer is obvious, but when you start to think about it, it actually becomes a lot more complex. So Jacobson, in the reading for today, says that international migrants are defined as those who leave their home countries and take up residence in another country for more than 1 year. That's a pretty serviceable definition, but you already start to run into what my students term the whatabouts. So what about seasonal migrants? What about someone who was raised in Johor, Malaysia, but lives and works in Singapore, yet travels across a bridge a few kilometers and across a border every week to visit home? What about nomadic people? What about stateless people? Both of these groups still exist in the world today. What about students who study abroad for less than a year? What about someone who goes to Thailand for 9 months to get a heart surgery and then recover? So pretty soon, you start to think, well, how do we define this? And you could, like Supreme Court Justice Stewart famously said regarding obscenity, you could just say, well, I know it when I see it. And in fact, that works pretty well. We know what migration is from context. We can differentiate it from things like commuting or tourism. We know it from the circumstances. But where it starts to get problematic is when you start to categorize different kinds of migration and different kinds of migrants. And why is that? Well, it's because categories matter. Categories matter in terms of the treatment that migrants receive both when they leave their country and when they enter new ones. It matters in terms of the ways and the types of aid and help that are available to migrants. And it matters in terms of migrants' legal rights and legal status as they migrate. So how you are categorized, how you are fixed in the system, has an impact on every aspect of your migration experience. So what are some of the ways that we can categorize migrants? Well, these are just a few. Internal versus international, voluntary versus involuntary, documented versus undocumented, temporary versus permanent, highly skilled versus less skilled, and any number of reasons that we attribute to why migrants are moving. Environmental migrants, labor migrants, marriage migrants, refugees, educational migrants, medical migrants, etc. So there's lots of different ways in which we can define migration and migrants, and we can kind of classify it. And these are the kinds of charts that migration scholars love to make. But you shouldn't take any of them too seriously. They're all just an attempt for us to kind of fix these ideas in our head. So today we've already sort of agreed that we're talking about international migration. And usually when people say migration in this kind of context, that's what they're talking about. Now, international and internal migration, it's a fairly easy determination. It's an either or. It's like an on-off switch. Either you cross a national border or you don't. You are either an internal migrant or an international migrant. Now, there actually are some exceptions to that, but I won't get into that right now. But for the most part, it's pretty easy to define whether someone's an internal or international migrant. But what about other kinds of migration? Well, it starts to get a lot more complicated. So let's tackle a big one, voluntary versus involuntary migration. Now, why the international distinction is basically an either or, the problem is that voluntary and involuntary migration isn't. It exists instead on a continuum, or perhaps as a four-dimensional web, who knows? You can look up different kinds of charts. At one end of the continuum, you have people who are fleeing for their lives or from immediate harm, and most people agree that these people are clearly involuntary migrants and should qualify for asylum and legal intervention on their behalf. Now, whether they receive that or not is another question. At the other end of the continuum, you have people who choose to migrate, usually they're very wealthy people, who choose to migrate for purely lifestyle reasons. So, for example, they want to live in a warm climate, they want to pay less taxes, they always dreamed of living in Paris, etc. The problem is that since it's a continuum, most people fall on the spectrum somewhere between these two poles. And so suddenly defining who's a voluntary and who's an involuntary migrant becomes a lot more difficult. First of all, there's the matter of when you decide to migrate. If you wait to flee from violence or hunger until the danger is imminent, it may be too late. So many potential refugees have to evaluate danger and make hard decisions about when to go. So does that take them out of the realm of involuntary and into the realm of voluntary migrants? The answer in terms of international policy is usually a qualified no. They still qualify as involuntary migrants. The problem is that national officials and the general public in the countries that they are fleeing to may not agree with the migrants' assessment of their danger, or they may just not care because it's politically or economically or otherwise inconvenient. Now, this is a trend that we're seeing increasingly in the world today as the world deals with multiple, seemingly endless refugee crises. But as we can see from this example, this is far from a new issue. And while political violence is often considered to be a fairly clear-cut case of involuntary migration, what about people who are fleeing domestic violence, sexual violence, gang violence, violence at the hands of their own police or paramilitary forces? What about people who are fleeing because of their sexual orientation or gender identity? What about people who are conscripted against their will to serve in military or rebel forces? Should these people be considered involuntary migrants and refugees? These are the questions that are constantly debated at the international policy level, and these policies may be changed, interpreted, or simply ignored in very different circumstances. In the meantime, if you're facing one of these situations, you may be forced to make a decision to migrate whether or not the laws and policies are currently on your side. In addition, even if there isn't imminent danger of violence, but instead, it's a matter of poverty or environmental degradation, at what point are your circumstances so bleak that you make the choice to move? What happens if local or national economy collapses because of a crisis abroad? What happens if there's yet another drought and you're in danger of losing your land and you owe the bank for the loan to buy seed, fertilizer, and pesticide? When do you decide to stay, and when do you decide to go? In these cases, the decision to migrate is less clear-cut. Are you an involuntary migrant or a voluntary one? And again, if you wait too long, or you are too poor to begin with, the so-called poorest of the poor, migration may not be an option for you. Migration internationally is very expensive. Most migrants spend pretty much everything they have or go into significant debt in order to migrate abroad. So often migration under these less clear-cut circumstances is a strategic and family decision. Some family members may decide to stay put. Other family members may decide to migrate seasonally or permanently inside their own country, while still other family members may decide to try their luck and migrate internationally, in the hopes that they might be able to make daily survival at home easier to follow. Now, I just put this up here so you could sort of see how complicated it is. It's not going to be a test, so don't worry about it. Now, other reasons why people may migrate internationally include, yes, providing for daily survival at home. That is a motivation for many migrants. But others want to do things like amass capital in order to send a child or a sibling to school, to buy land or livestock, to start a business, or to save for some other reason. And some are able to do that. So, there are degrees of poverty and need, and there's also the question of aspiration and the desire to improve one's life and the life of one's children. If you are poor but surviving, but you see no hope for the future, no hope that your children might have a better life, then that's not something we can easily dismiss. Yes, it's not as clear-cut as imminent danger, but human beings have to have hope as well as food and safety. And food and safety, not just today, but into the future. So, I'm not suggesting that the needs of those migrants at one end of the spectrum are the same as those at the other, or that policies shouldn't address the differences in this kind of continuum between involuntary and voluntary migration. But it is good to keep in mind that this is actually a much more complex question than it first appears. But there are still more complications in considering voluntary versus involuntary migration. You knew it couldn't be that easy. All right, so let's say, for the sake of a thought experiment, for the sake of our argument, that you are clearly a refugee, someone who has fled a war zone, and you make your way across the border into a camp, say in Greece or Jordan or Kenya or Bangladesh. And your case is so clear-cut in this thought experiment that you're one of the very few lucky people who qualifies to undergo the arduous and grueling process of applying for asylum and immigration to a third country, say to Iran or Malaysia or even Germany or Canada. So you and hopefully your family have, after losing everything, after a harrowing and traumatic journey, reached relative safety. I say relative because the camps themselves are quite dangerous. And you're ready to start your lives over. Now what? Well, now you're faced with an existential question. Are you to be a refugee and nothing else forevermore? Is that the whole of your identity now? Is everything up to your life at this point? Your education, your relationships, your hopes, your dreams, your skills, your work. Does that mean anything anymore? Are you just a label at this point? And of course, that comes with kinds of practical considerations as well. You are safe, relatively, but that's a baseline. You still have to survive and sustain yourself. You have to make a living, you have to feed yourself and your family. You probably are living in substandard conditions, and you're relying on local governments and populations who view you with increasing hostility as each week and month passes. The longer you spend living in the camp with no privacy and little dignity, the less people outside the barbed wires view you as fully human, and the more they're more likely to view you as a nuisance at best, or as something subhuman or even not human at all at worst. Some questions you may ask, in addition to the more existential ones, are the more practical ones. Can you work legally? What will it take for you to get a work permit and leave the camp? How will you get an apartment? How will you apply for utilities? How will you get your food? Will your children be able to go to local schools? Will you face hostility from the local population in terms of racism or religious intolerance? What if you were a teacher or a nurse or an engineer before? Will you be able to eventually get your credentials recognized and practice your chosen field again? Will you ever be able to return to your home country, even for a visit? Or is that door closed to you now? In other words, no matter if you are an involuntary or voluntary migrant, or like most migrants, somewhere on that spectrum, these kinds of economic, social, and political considerations cannot be untangled from each other. And furthermore, in migration studies, we have a saying, and that is that all migration is economic migration. because all migrants have to be able to access economic resources. That usually means work. Whether they're fleeing from violence or migrating to escape poverty or moving overseas to go to college so that they can get a better job in the future. But there's still another level to consider when it comes to the distinction between voluntary and involuntary migration. When it comes to the contemporary migration of poor people and to those who are fleeing violence or refugees, the labels voluntary and involuntary are also used synonymously with the categories of economic and political migration. In other words, those who are fleeing conflict are hopefully classified as involuntary migrants and described as being political migrants and therefore worthy of help. While those who are merely seeking work abroad are classified as voluntary or economic migrants and therefore less worthy of help, and perhaps it's even said that they have impure motives. They're greedy. The fact is that the ability to decide and define whether a migrant is a political migrant or an economic migrant is a tool. It's a tool that governments, political parties, various interest groups can and do use all the time for their own ends. And these definitions are not static. They shift and change constantly. So that leads us in a roundabout way to the question of documented versus undocumented migration, or legal versus illegal migration. Now, the issue here isn't so much that states make these kinds of determinations about who may legally enter and stay in a country and who may not. That's perhaps a bigger debate that we could have at a different time. Instead, the issue is about how these rules are made and what has the right to make those rules and also to apply, or in many cases, ignore those rules. Now, we're all adults here, I hope, so we can dispense with the notion that what constitutes legal versus illegal migration is necessarily or even usually associated with some kind of fair, objective, or pure and unbiased criteria for making that kind of distinction. There are always economic rationales, political distinctions, and social values at work in creating and enforcing immigration policy. Furthermore, legal systems and policies are not static. They're constantly being debated, interpreted, challenged, clarified, and in the case of legislation, changed and modified. What this means in practical terms is that all migrants, even highly skilled migrants, are faced with incredibly complex, ever-shifting systems of laws, regulations, and policies that they must navigate if they want to migrate legally to a particular country. And the system can fail or eliminate you at any point during this process. So there are constant shifting goalposts, and you're trying to play the world's most complicated game of soccer. Now, it may sound like I'm advocating for an ignorance of the law defense here, but I'm not. But it is a good idea to keep in mind that the complexity that potential migrants face is sort of a sinkhole trap as they try to navigate these systems legally. Does this seem like I'm offering an extreme scenario? Well, we live in a country now where the government has made initial moves to revoke the legal status of migrants who have already been granted permanent residency or in some cases have already been naturalized as US citizens. And that does not just include those with criminal records. Now that hasn't happened yet, but there's a lot of gray area there. Does this mean that we should just open the borders? Some say yes. Again, that's a debate we could have. But we all live in the actual world here. And we know that some immigration policy will and will continue to be the reality. So do I have a magical 2,000-point plan to reform immigration laws and to fix everything? No, I do not. And hopefully I wouldn't be here today if I did. I'd be in Washington running for Senate. But we can start with a recognition that it's never simply a question of voluntary versus involuntary, economic versus political. How these kinds of choices are made and how they're enforced is not free from political or economic interests, and they have real consequences not just for migrants, but for all of us. So we owe it both to migrants and to ourselves to really try to understand and dig more deeply into how we view migration and how we view immigration. So, for the last few minutes, I want to shift direction a little bit. So far, we've been talking about migration in what economists would call supply terms. In other words, we've been looking at migrants and why and how they choose to migrate, what goes into their decision-making process. And I want to look at the other side of the coin here for just a minute and take a look at the demand side before wrapping up. So the one thing that all of the very acrimonious and bitter debates about immigration in wealthy countries tend to gloss over is the growing demand for migrant labor in wealthy countries and middle-income countries in the world today. Now, you may already be aware that there's growing demand for highly skilled labor. Medical professionals, engineers, software designers, scientists, and so forth. This growing demand has sometimes been termed the war for talent, and a number of wealthy countries have put into place strong incentive programs to attract this talent to migrate, either temporarily or permanently. So when President Macron of France, back when we still all liked him, said, I made a plea after the US election in 2016 that climate scientists should come to France, grade A political theater, yes, but it was also a genuine request. And at this point, I think 21 scientists from the United States and elsewhere have relocated to France to continue their work there. Yeah, exactly. But the basic demographics of the world and how those are shifting also means that there's demand for all kinds of labor, including those jobs that are usually classified as less skilled or low skilled. These include agricultural workers, always, food services, light manufacturing, construction work, domestic and care work, janitorial work, driving work, security work, and all kinds of other jobs that are usually classified as the triple D, dirty, demeaning, and dangerous. This work is typically low paid and filled either by internal migrants or from migrants from the global south. And these are the migrants that are the focus of anti-immigrant sentiment and often labeled as a burden on the state or as out to steal jobs. And it is true that immigration, particularly undocumented immigration, can depress local wages, at least in the short term, which interestingly enough is why business communities in most countries are usually, quietly, very pro-immigration. However, it's also the case that even if these jobs become available, because, say, of Brexit, local people are often unwilling to do them even if wages are raised. But let's look at the bigger picture. The general trend in the world today is that while human population is still growing and will continue to grow because of demographic momentum, the growth rate in individual countries around the world is, with very few exceptions, either slowed down dramatically, stopped, or is now in active decline. Wealthy countries, in particular, are facing a demographic squeeze. An advanced economy relies on the labor of those in their work years, roughly 18 to 65, to maintain the tax base and the consumption or spending base that keeps the economy moving, pays for infrastructure and services that take care of those who cannot work. Most industrial or post-industrial economies also depend on constant economic growth. It's not enough that you continue to do as well this year, next year. You have to continue to grow your economy to be considered successful. That's very difficult to achieve if you don't have a working population that regularly reproduces itself. In addition, in much of the developing world, including Europe, Japan, South Korea, the United States, and Canada, is looking forward to or is already experiencing an unprecedented number of people in the age 65 plus range. This is particularly true in regards to the generational cohorts that follow. So this is leading to what some social scientists are terming a looming labor crisis. In other words, these countries need people to continue to grow the economy as a whole, as well as to take care of the very young, the old, and the sick. And care doesn't just include medical care. All sorts of tasks that we don't really value in our culture, because it's usually labeled as women's work, is necessary for human life and for the economy. This work has to be done. So a lot of what we hear about today are about makers and innovators, but social scientists argue that actually people who are carers or maintainers are equally important. So here we are, at least in the developed world, with a growing need for labor on the one hand, and a growing anti-immigration sentiment on the other. Well, it turns out this is quite a pickle. So what are countries doing to address these demographic shifts? Some are not doing anything. It's either not an immediate concern, or the political environment has become so polarized that it's almost impossible to have a conversation about how we're going to view or change immigration in the future. Some countries have made moves towards what's called natalism. In layman's terms, that's encouraging women to have more babies. This is a very problematic approach for a number of reasons, some of which are evident. First and foremost, no matter how you dress it up, it rests on the principle that some kinds of babies and people are better than others. People, and women in particular, in the desired groups are often shamed or scolded for not doing their national duty, which often connects nationalism with traditional gender roles, while women in other groups, along with immigrants, are told in so many words, you and your potential or actual children are neither wanted nor needed. Second, and less seriously, it just doesn't work. I know, it's shocking. Do it for mom is not an effective strategy. It turns out for most people, when they're making decisions about family size, national duty actually comes in pretty low on their list of priorities. Any success that these programs have tend to come from real incentives. Tax breaks help, yes, but things like reforming laws so you have affordable medical care, affordable child care, closing wage gaps, generous parental leave programs, etc. Encouraging, shaming, and one-time offers such as have a second child, you'll receive a refrigerator. That was an actual program in Russia. Don't work. But countries keep trying, mostly because they can't or won't make the kinds of choices that would make a real difference in the future. A more logical solution at the aggregate level is immigration. Supply meets demand. And in fact, people are enacting this solution every day. And that's why we see these increased flows from the global south to the global north. Certainly, people in the global south want to migrate for a better life, to send money home, but they are migrating because there's demand and work for them in the places that they're migrating to. It's also a good idea to keep in mind that most immigration policy, is reactive rather than proactive. It's usually reacting to things that we're already seeing happening. So people make their own decisions, and they go forth and they live their lives, and then policy plays catch up. So here we are, and even if it's only in personal or national interest, that's all we were concerned with, which I assume most of us are not, since we're at a place called WorldOregon and we're talking about global issues. Nevertheless, it's time to take a good, hard look at what anti-immigration sentiment may cost us as a country and as individuals in the coming decades. I think about this a lot. I'm a member of the sandwich generation, and I take my mom to a lot of doctor's appointments. And I think you all know where I'm going with this, so I won't spell that out. This is particularly important in some wealthier countries, have started to recognize the need for more immigration in the future. Canada, always ahead of the curve. And they are either quietly reworking immigration policy, and at the same time, they're trying to make shifts in cultural and social attitudes to be more open to immigration. Well, I'm definitely out of time, but I want to wrap up with a few thoughts about what we can, as individuals and citizens, do to help change and open up the conversation about migration and move away from polarizing and reductive understandings. So what can we do? Well, first of all, we can demand accountability to the truth. To facts and statistics, often myths, half-truths, and outright lies in our era of social media circulate and recirculate. The media and politicians have to be held to account, and that often means holding ourselves and those we love to account as well. Another thing that we can do related to the first is listen to migrants, refugees, and members of the diaspora at different levels. And this includes supporting basic research on migration and what's actually happening. Third, we need to commit to viewing migrants and refugees as whole, complex human beings with complex lives and real needs. There's an increasing tendency to dehumanize and other migrants, particularly poor migrants. And one of the most powerful things that we can do as individuals is to call that out when we see it. Much more pleasantly, we can enjoy and celebrate an increasingly diverse and transnational world. Taco trucks on every corner sounds incredible to me. And finally, I always tell my students, stand up for migrants and refugees in ways that make sense for you. Some people are letter writers, some people are marchers, some people like to work things out in meetings, some people like to help in their own backyard, and some people like to advocate for people around the world. So choose your path and trust that others will take up the tasks that you cannot. Or in the words of pro tennis player and civil rights hero Arthur Ashe, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. Thank you.
Thanks, Maureen. A reminder, if you have a question, it needs to be on the mic. As I pointed out last week when we talked about North Korea, I will rain with fire and fury down upon you if you do not. Then I will ask the first question. So I've been hearing from friends in Colombia about the huge amount of folks who are leaving Venezuela. So this is a situation that we hear about what's happening in Venezuela, but we don't hear about what the human story is around that. Are there situations or stories like what we're seeing with Colombia and Venezuela that we should be paying more attention to?
Yes, certainly. And I think that there's always, compassion fatigue is a real thing, and the news cycle, as we all know, has become absolutely crazy. So keeping up with things is very difficult. But I do find that regularly if you are a regular consumer of, say, the New York Times or the Post, you will find out about these things. Whether they get the coverage they need is another question. So places like Yemen, ongoing situation in Israel, the situation in Myanmar with the Rohingya people and so forth. These are all situations that are unfolding right now. It's easy to become very overwhelmed. I find that it's useful for me to check in about once a month with a variety of different resources. The International Organization of Migration is a UN agency. They have a lot of good facts and information. So if you're interested in kind of finding out more and what you can do, they're a good resource. Also, the Migration Policy Institute, which is a US-based policy research institute, has a lot of good information as well, specifically also about US immigration policy and what's happening here. So if that's your interest, that's a good resource as well.
A lot of focus in on your slides, Japan and Korea. So traditionally, two of the most homogeneous societies on Earth, in some level of desperation, now coming to be more open to immigration. Do you think that desperation will result in policies that actually make a difference in those two places?
Yeah, I think we're already seeing that happen. One of the reasons why is because they are such amazing case studies. The other is that, you talk about what you know, and I know East and Southeast Asia the best. It's been very interesting to kind of see both Japan and South Korea kind of try to come to grips with this looming and now happening demographic crisis. And so they've taken similar paths, but also different paths. So both countries have tried to promote what they term the immigration of co-ethnics. So these are people who are of Japanese or Korean ancestry, but are, Japanese Peruvian or Japanese Brazilian or Korean Canadian, Canadian Korean, and so forth. For Japan, there was this sort of idea that because these people were ethnically Japanese, that there would be some sort of osmosis that would allow them to kind of adapt to Japanese society very easily. That did not turn out to be the case. So now both countries are, to a certain extent, moving away from those kinds of policies. Korea less so because they had a more clear-eyed view of it. You also see a lot of marriage migration into South Korea. So in addition to having the problem of just low birth rates, you have an issue of, similar to in the United States, of the aging farmer bachelor phenomenon. So men in particular living in rural Korea, were unable to find women who would want to marry them, and so increasingly they're marrying women from Vietnam, the Philippines, and China. And the way in which that works is that the Korean state and society is now kind of reworking these women's identities to kind of argue that they're more fully Korean than even Korean women because they embody Korean traditional female values better. So it's this weird kind of mental math that's happening. But both countries have started enacting legislation that allows for more immigration, particularly of low-wage or so-called low-skilled categories. What Japan did for a long time, and South Korea to a lesser extent, is they had everything except for the most highly skilled migration was usually illegal, or at least in a very gray zone. And this was convenient because even though they would have this low-wage migration come in, it was easy to kind of kick them out when it became politically inconvenient or there was an economic downturn. But now, as you saw from that headline, Japan needs immigrants, but do immigrants need Japan? So why would someone from Nepal or Cambodia go to Japan rather than to Singapore or Taiwan or someplace like that? So now they're going to having to rework those kinds of policies. South Korea has also moved to completely rewrite its constitution to argue that Korea is now a multicultural state. South Korea is still one of the most homogeneous countries in the world, but they've made a real policy shift to be welcoming to immigrants, to have things like multicultural festivals in Seoul. And you do see immigrants in places like Seoul and Daegu and so forth, who are much more sort of in the public eye than in the past. So you are starting to see some shifts. It'll be interesting to see how they deal with the question of national identity moving forward with these changes. Yeah. I know I'm supposed to wait till someone has a mic.
You go back there. This way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, could I follow up on that?
Yeah.
Because it goes to the point you made about government policy, sex night and whatever, not being that effective. And as far as I understand, in Korea, yeah, they really did push for marrying outside. But in fact, the trend has been very poor. The divorce rate is extremely high among foreign-born women. The prejudice against their children is extremely high. So my question is, can government policy alone make a difference if you have social opposition?
Yeah, no, it cannot. So government policy is usually a step in the right direction, and it can take political courage to make those kinds of changes. But yes, you have to have the kinds of shifts in other areas of society for that to really work. And so you have seen this, particularly around, when we're talking about love, marriage, reproduction, and so forth. These are very tricky issues. These are actual people we're talking about. A lot of the ways in which migration, or at least labor migration, is looked at in the world today is as if migrants actually genuinely live in two places, so that they work in one place and their minds or their loyalties or their loves or their relationships are back at home. But as we all know, that's not how human beings are. We are a package deal, right? So where our labor goes, we go. And so what you start to see are all kinds of complications. So Singapore, for example, has for a long time had these pro-natalist policies, including the video which I show my students, which is a rap about doing your national duty on national night, because nothing's more romantic than making a baby on, the Independence Day, I guess. And that's not how human reproduction works either. But Singapore allows a lot of migrants, low-wage migrants, into their country, but they separate by gender and occupation. So if you want to come in as a domestic worker, you're a female worker, you're usually going to be working as domestic work. You will be coming from Cambodia, Indonesia, or the Philippines. If you want to come in and do construction work, driving work, those kinds of heavy labor work, which are usually men, you come from southern China, southern India, or Bangladesh, or sometimes Thailand. And the idea is so that the migrants won't meet, get married, and settle down in Singapore. What we actually see are great increases in the number of remittances or money being sent to Southeast Asia from South Asia because men and women still find a way to meet and start families, even if they're not allowed to stay in Singapore. So these issues get incredibly complicated because we're talking about actual human beings with complicated lives. And a lot of migration policy tries to kind of separate the person from their labor or from their migration, and so it just doesn't usually work out, but it ends up creating a lot of interesting scenarios as a result. So I don't know what will happen in places like Korea, South Korea, or Japan, or Singapore, but these are issues that they're having to come to grips with, and governments are not always the ones that are best equipped to kind of keep up with these changes, so we'll see what happens. Marilyn, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did have a question. So a lot of borders are just these kind of weird arbitrary lines that clearly are causing a lot of issues. Do you think that open borders is perhaps a good solution?
In theory, I think that there's a lot to argue in favor of at least more open borders. But I don't think that that's a realistic possibility. And so I think what I'm more interested in is kind of changing the conversation and trying to find ways in which we can have honest conversations about immigration and migration and work that are not then kind of twisted to certain political ends. How we can do that, I'm not entirely sure. So, there's libertarians, for example, argue that open borders are a good idea because you want to have the free flow of people just as you have the free flow of information and other goods and things. I can see the appeal of that, but I don't see that happening. So states are not interested in giving up their sovereignty. So yeah. Yeah.
So to follow up on what you just said about the conversation, do you ever have a thoughtful, well-spoken person in your class that takes the other side of this issue, or is the bias always in favor of migration?
Well, it's not a matter of being in favor or not in favor of migration. Migration is happening, and so what we want to know is sort of what is happening and why it's happening. In terms of taking the other side, I think that there's certainly arguments for certain kinds of migration or, limiting certain kinds of migration. I find it very hard to talk about that in the abstract. So if we're looking at particular case studies, certainly people have different opinions. But my approach is that, we need to look at what's actually happening. We need to look at the numbers. We need to look at the real economic impacts that are resulting from these flows. We can do the cost benefits analysis. And whatever that is that's what we should be talking about. So that's, yeah.
I think I'm next. What suggestions do you have for the U.S.? How can we integrate, or acclimate, or bring them in and make them part of the society? What suggestions would you have?
Well, I would say that there's a kind of a battle going on for the soul of America. And that sounds very dramatic, but that's always the case all the time in every country. So that makes it a little less dramatic. And so when I teach about nationalism isn't just one thing. Nationalism is, sort of our identity as a people. And so there are always competing views on who we should be or what kind of people we should be, what kind of country we should be. So in the United States, we have different views of what it means to be American that are constantly kind of under debate or being argued. most people would argue that the United States is a multicultural society. It's a society of immigrants, and that's something that perhaps we want to preserve. Some people would not argue that. They would argue the opposite. I think the reality of it is that migrants tend to assimilate and to make their kind of place in the world by themselves. So this doesn't always happen overnight. Sometimes it takes generations. We now live in a world where it's possible to continue to speak multiple languages and keep your own customs and so forth alive, you know, while still living in a very different place. So we have to kind of come to grips with that. In terms of helping migrants, particularly refugees, which, as I said, are a very small number, U.S. refugee resettlement programs have historically been pretty successful. So what happens is that, you know, both in Canada, the United States, some other countries, if refugees are accepted, they are given a certain amount of status, they are then resettled, usually try to resettle them in a sort of dispersed geographical formation. What usually happens is that after refugees have been in a place for a certain number of years, they tend to move to the nearest big city and then form ethnic enclaves as well. But that doesn't mean that they're not adapting to life in their new country. So traditionally, you know, they get aid and help for a few years, and then they have to kind of make it on their own. They have to find work. They have to, you know, kind of integrate in whatever ways. The other side of that is that it's been shown repeatedly that resettling refugees or settling migrants in communities that are not majority migrant is very, very helpful in creating understanding and connections between different groups of people. So one of the trends that we've seen in the United States, which is very distressing, is that people are increasingly isolated into their own socioeconomic and ethnic groups. By neighborhoods, by cities, by states, if you will. And so when refugees or migrants live next to people who are not refugees or migrants, and you get to know them as people, that generally leads to increased tolerance and acceptance of migrants and communities. So again, I don't have an easy answer for that. But I think that there are ways that we have used in the past. There's studies that have been done, and there are certainly ways in which we can increase people's interaction with others that are not like them, which can lead to sort of increased integration and assimilation, if we want to use the term assimilation. So I can't give a short answer, sorry people.
That's great.
Not possible.
Maureen, thank you. Will you come back next year and talk about something?
Oh, sure.
Okay, let's give Maureen Hickey a hand. So, to wrap up, I think what's interesting is I can think of two communities, one of which I grew up in, the other one which was sort of next door, Dearborn, Michigan. If you look at what Dearborn has been doing in terms of not just integration but assimilation and kind of a successful community civic ecology with their the sort of pan-Muslim community has been really, really interesting. I grew up in Minneapolis where you've got 70,000 Somalis and you see them in every walk of life, but they do that well because they did that the generation earlier with Cambodians and Vietnamese and looked at this from assets and not from deficits. So I think you can find snapshots of this around the country. I think the other way to talk to people about this is recognizing the universal in this. Look at our literature. The pilgrimage in Chaucer, you know, the Odyssey reimagined by Derek Walcott into the Caribbean. Going from here to there, the migration story is something that is central to who we are as human beings. And so I think that there's always a way to bring the conversation back around to what we share and not what separates us. One more note, this is our final day, which means that as of tomorrow, those Great Decisions books are collector's items up there with Thomas Kincaid paintings. So $22, you can get this year's Great Decisions book. If you don't have it, it's always great to pull out, you know, at dinner parties and test people. So thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.